Let me invite our other panelists up onto the stage to dive deeper into some of these issues. So we're delighted to have joining Michèle on the stage several distinguished colleagues who will be known to you: Admiral Phil Davidson, Evan Medeiros, and the Honorable Kim Beazley. Welcome. So Phil Davidson, as many of you know, was the 25th commander of the U.S. Indo-PACOM from 2018 to 2021. He commanded U.S. Fleet Forces Command in the Atlantic, the 6th Fleet Strike Force NATO in Europe, an aircraft carrier strike group. He's also held key policy positions in the NSC, the Pentagon, State Department, and has a number of academic and think tank affiliations. Evan Medeiros is currently professor and Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, where I am on leave from. Evan has a number of books on U.S.-China relations. He's a well-regarded China scholar and has a new book, Cold Rivals, The New Era of U.S.-China Strategic Competition.
Well played.
So rush out and get one?
Which you didn't bring 200 free copies? No. And this is a book you worked on with both U.S. and Chinese authors. So it's actually quite rare. I've done these in the past, as have you, but today, to have a joint assessment of U.S.-China relations in the international system where U.S., American, and Chinese authors are both contributing is actually quite a rare thing, and Evan pulled that off, so it's well worth reading. Evan was on the National Security Council staff of the White House for 6 years. I did almost 5 years and barely survived. I don't know how you did it.
I had to outdo you.
You did. You one upped me. In the Obama administration, he was director for China, Taiwan, Mongolia, and then the senior director for East Asia. And Kim Beazley, everyone knows, he's on our board. That's his most important identifier, and also is the chair of the board for the Perth US Asia Center, run by Gordon Flake. He was the 33rd governor of Western Australia, a leader in the Labour Party, deputy prime minister, defense minister, and a very effective ambassador in Washington, D.C. So I want to broaden to the global before we get into the U.S., China, and Indo-Pacific. The U.S. has to think globally. We didn't used to like to, but we have to. There's a famous Herb Block, the cartoonist for the Washington Post, for decades and decades, had a cartoon in the Post during World War II where General MacArthur, who commanded in this region, is meeting with George Marshall, the chief of staff, and he's brought in a globe of the world, and it's a block. And it has Asia on top, and then the European theater's underneath, and he says to General Marshall, we need all the resources for our theater, and General Marshall in this cartoon says, actually in the Pentagon, we prefer to use a round globe. I want to talk for a little bit with the panel about how the U.S. and its allies and partners prioritize, manage resources, manage attention span when right now the whole world is in flames in some ways. And Phil, I know you suffered through this at Indo-PACOM, and I wanted to start with you. The counter-ISIS was happening when you were in Indo-PACOM. I mean, a lot of things were happening. How do you think about Indo-PACOM's mission, resources, attention from Washington when you're a COCOM, when you're commanding in one part of the world like this one?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the heart of it, you have to carry on, right? I had specific, guidance on the overall national strategy. I had the department's guidance on what the priorities were in the country, and you would say every operational low strategic commander always has resource shortcomings in the history of warfare. You have to deal with it. And that's the way you kind of stepped out. I would say, and this goes right, what I think is largely one of the main themes of the conference, you have to lean on your alliances and partnerships across the region to, affect your strategy. My conversations with Australia and Japan especially were extraordinarily transparent and really helpful to me. And in large respect, I think where we are today was perhaps sparked in those conversations. And I'm quite proud of the work that Indo-PACOM did during that time frame.
And that's a helpful reminder of what Michèle said about the agency allies can have if they're blunt.
Yeah.
So Kim, as you know well as a historian and as a policymaker, Australia has a long history well beyond this region, in the Middle East in particular, and Western Europe. So thinking globally as a U.S. ally is not a new thing for Australia, but as defense minister when you're in Washington, how did you handle this? How'd you keep Australia relevant, the U.S. Engaged, when you were in Washington, of course, the Middle East was also not stable?
Well, it was actually quite easy. I'm glad to have Evan here. My life became impossible as an ambassador when two things happened. First, Kurt left the State Department, and then Evan left the National Security Council. And I could always rely on them for detailed advice on all the things that we ought to be doing. They're just terrific. There's a habit, people don't last long in the National Security Council because it's literally 24/7 for them. And the only way you could tell a difference, and I'd sometimes have Evan come over for a plate of cheese and a couple of drinks, a cigar actually, more importantly. And the only way you could tell it was the weekend is he'd wear jeans. So he'd be in the office wearing jeans at the weekend, but otherwise he's wearing a suit. And then PACOM, which I still call SINCPAC because I just can't get on with the new nomenclature. Kat Weinberger was always disturbed about things that we were doing. And so he used to plead with me every time we turned up in DC. He said, please, when you're doing anything, will you get in touch with SINCPAC and tell them what we're doing, because we do view the region through the prism of SINCPAC. And we take an awful lot of notice of what SINCPAC was saying. There was a chap who headed up at that time, Admiral Crowe, I recollect. And Crowe was obsessed with conventional submarines because it had been his last active command. So but that's got nothing to do with it. Look, I think the most important thing now is that in terms of where we're headed on the atmospheric that we're creating, the last two OSMIN reports need to be read because they're very different from previous OSMIN reports. If you look at them carefully, what you see is the United States positioning itself in Australia. And when I was ambassador, it was sort of there in the so-called rebalance towards the Asia-Pacific, but it didn't have much put into it. Now what the United States is telling us is that they have worked out a different axis. They used to have only one axis on China. It was basically east-west through the Confucian societies. Now the Americans have added to that axis north-south. So that puts them through the Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian societies as well. But more importantly, it is for operational purposes an angle on China where China is not well structured, and that's important. I think every now and then, when I was looking at statements on the AUKUS legislation by who's the Admiral? Anyway, it was his statement to last week. You can see something of that in the way in which he is testifying about the submarine. So when I was an ambassador, the most important, I used to say back to Australia, the most important meeting anywhere on the globe during the course of the year was the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. And as ambassadors, we made a huge effort to try and I just interrogate all the American comments, people both before and after it, to get a clear idea of how the US was handling it. We were happy. In those days, of course, the world talked about multipolarity, but there was a subset of the multipolarity argument, and that was the duopoly. United States and China. How do you get the United States and China to marry up objectives? And that's the most important thing. Everybody objected to the idea of a world duopoly of the United States and China, except us. I used to say to the Americans, such good news. Just keep on going. And they would say, we're not doing that. So that was but nevertheless, that was the atmospheric of the times. And I do know when it changed and the American attitude began to get re-educated, it was not actually in 2015 and 2017. It was Xi's visit to the United States early in 2012. And all hopes were on Xi. This is the reformer. This is the guy who's going to take the next step, take us a point further. And then you have, I was just reading my cable on the other day home from Kurt, he said, we were totally baffled by Xi's attitude towards us. He only agreed with us on one thing, and that was Iran. Everything else, he stood us up. He stiff-armed us. South China Sea, Taiwan, you name it. He stiff-armed us. This is not what we expected. And maybe this indicates that things are going to go in a somewhat different direction. I think what we have to do with the United States is, firstly, we have to acknowledge that this shift is taking place in American strategic perspectives and tell the Americans that we will do it. That we are prepared to have the facilities used in that way. And the Americans need to comprehend that we have and I'll finish one more thing on this. They need to comprehend that they are not alone and that other people want to take responsibility. The best moment I had when I was an ambassador in the President's office was when Abbott was visiting. And Abbott was sort of the anti-Obama. Everything Obama believed in, Abbott didn't. And
I remember that visit.
And it was quite intriguing because I'd spent all night writing weasel words for Abbott and he didn't look at them, because I realised that the excellent briefings that we normally get from PM&C and Foreign Affairs were not really going to hack it. And then the conversation went on. Obama, in his erudite way, sort of presented this and that, and you could see on his words, and they're always elegant, hook, 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 that he's got to pillory Abbott with, because we had a huge gathering there of the American cognoscenti, or nomenclature, or responsory, whichever way you want to look at it. And Abbott, and then he said, Tony, you might like to say something before we get into the discussion of substance. And Abbott said, well, yes, there is something I want to say, Barack. Firstly, we've got no complaints. We're happy with US policy. Secondly, we don't want anything from you. We know we can get everything that we want, but we want you to understand that we understand that you're about to get into a lot of trouble in the Middle East. And when you do, we're going to be there in numbers. And I kept getting reported back to me by people who'd been through the White House or whatever, saying, we need more Tony Abbotts. That's what Obama was saying, we need more Tony Abbotts. So I think that on us and the Japanese, a new maturity is being visited. You have to have the American back, and it has to be obvious that you do.
You know, that lesson is important. In the 5 years I was on the NSC staff, the most effective ambassadors were people like Michael Foley from Australia, Katsuro from Japan, who go in to see Connie Rice or sometimes the president, and would spend the first 15 minutes on what they were doing to help before they did an ask. But I learned something important now, though. Michael Foley and Dennis Richardson never offered me cigars. So
really?
Yeah.
Idiots.
Yeah. So important note for Kevin Rudd. So Evan, you were there when Tony Abbott told President Obama it's going to get hot in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So, and you and I lived this experience. I was there, for 9/11. How did you think about keeping the focus on East Asia? When you could see the counter-ISIS campaign and all these other things, which are more violent, more immediate, more emotional, command attention politically, And in some ways, the Asia job is really about being disciplined most of the time. Occasionally, North Korea or
Discipline
somebody
and
provides a
focus,
crisis.
for sure.
So how did you keep on the ball?
You know, for us, in the latter part of the Obama administration, it wasn't as difficult as it may look in retrospect, simply because Xi Jinping, beginning around 2013, 2014, was starting to become a lot more aggressive and assertive. So the Chinese were making the case for more and better U.S. involvement in the Asia-Pacific, and we had more allies coming to us and partners coming to us saying we need some help. And that was certainly true with Japan when in fall of 2013, Mike, you may recall, the Chinese deployed the air defense identification zone over the East China Sea, clearly trying to undercut Japanese administration, right? So that was a sort of common point to come together. Of course, beginning in late 2013, 2014, you had the Chinese beginning this whole process of land reclamation, which we were all trying to figure out, which of course pulled the Vietnamese and the Filipinos closer to us. It created a pretext for Aquino to sort of really, the president of the Philippines at the time, to really move on negotiating or finalizing what's now become the EDCA agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which effectively provides us the legal basis for sort of quasi-military sites to go back in a significant way, just short of Clark and Subic. So in many ways, the Chinese made it a lot easier for us to do so. And when I think about the China challenge today, because of the way Xi Jinping has sought to present China to the world, and because it's generated so much backlash, it's in many ways made it very easy for the United States. Whereas in the Obama administration, we really struggled to coordinate more on the China challenge with Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Chinese alignment with Russia over that. It completely changed that conversation. And now you had European leaders being very concerned about the fact that China might draw the wrong lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and go after Taiwan. You begin to have European political leaders and business leaders start talking about de-risking from China so they don't face the same degree of vulnerability. So I think really it's the mistakes that the Chinese made created a perfect pretext for the U.S. to be able to.
Is it fair to say, I hope so because I wrote this, is it fair to say that the Obama administration did not come in expecting quite this China, the establishment of the strategic and economic dialogue, the Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg's perhaps not completely coordinated statement about the need for strategic reassurance, but there was an effort coming out of the Bush administration, where U.S.-China relations were pretty stable, to add more scaffolding, more structure, keep the stability going, make it more predictable. That seemed to be the opening play, but she had other ideas. Is that a fair summation of what happened?
So I think the key fact is, you're right. I mean, the Obama administration early on adopted the Bush administration playbook, very much so. Dialogue, engagement, strategic conversations. But here's the key fact. That was Hu Jintao. It was a fundamentally different government. And so it was the transition from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping that changed the strategic challenge that we're talking about today. And, even as a trained academic in international relations, the reality is whether you're a realist, a liberalist, a liberal institutionalist, a constructivist, the great man theory of international politics really it plays an important role, and people matter. And it was the ascension to power of Xi Jinping and the fact that he had fairly radical views about how to change the party in China and state-society relations, and we've only seen that accelerate as he sought to make Chinese politics more Leninist, he sought to make Chinese economics more statist, and then, of course, make diplomacy more aggressive and assertive. So the real reason why we switched from the Bush playbook of sort of responsible stakeholder using strategic dialogues to something that looked like we needed to be a lot more coercive and begin to build coalitions with capable and like-minded partners was simply because Xi Jinping changed. So as the China challenge changed with a new leader, our strategy had to change. And to be honest, we were there first before I think a lot of others. I mean, Japan was very closely in step with us. I mean, there were some differences with Japan, there were some differences, with Australia, but eventually over time, I think that because of the combination of the emergence of the era of strategic competition, I think because of COVID, and then of course because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it created this sort of shift in global politics, this sort of new era, the idea that the post-Cold War era is over, that created a fact pattern that now American allies and partners in both Asia and Europe can agree on. And to me, that's what's really different about the strategic environment today. I mean, Kurt talks about one theater, this idea that Asia is invested in Europe, Europe's invested in Asia in ways that we basically haven't seen in the post-Cold War era.
We'll hear from Gorana Gerkic this afternoon in our Allies and Partners discussion. Often in a conference in this region on Allies and Partners, you would not include NATO. But it is not quite one theater, but those dimensions are
It's moving more in that direction. I mean, the fact that NATO has now actively talked about Taiwan publicly and talked about Taiwan in its strategic documents. I mean, it never would have happened 10 years ago. And I mean, Japan, my understanding is now has an office in Brussels to liaise with NATO,
and I would give,
which is a great development.
I would give Abe a little more credit. He came to power again in Tokyo at the same time as Xi Jinping. And in some ways, he was Winston Churchill in the interwar years, sort of alone on this, and somewhat isolated at first.
Alone in what sense, Mike?
Alone in the sense that I would argue, and we can let Aki Nagashima speak to this if he wants to this afternoon, he was putting out in 2013 a strategy for competition with China that was comprehensive. It was one of the first. And I think with things like free and open Indo-Pacific, the elevation of the Quad, these are all things that Abe was championing 10 years ago, that the rest of us saw the logic of. But at first he was, cautious, alone.
But remember, Abe at the same time also wanted to continue and grow Japanese trade and investment.
Of course.
With China as well. So in many ways, it was a dual-handed strategy which made sense. And that's why it connected very well with remember in the Obama administration, we had the pivot strategy, which was growing alliance and partnerships, right? Japan, Korea. I mean, people forget. I mean, we completely rewrote the bilateral defense guidelines.
What I'm saying is that Abe's grand strategy is national security strategy, which Nobu Kanehara wrote, who's here, in 2013, sort of presented the blueprint of how you compete without catastrophe, how you compete strategically without losing because the ironic thing about the Abe administration was his support rate was high because of trade with China, so that he could build a consensus for a strategy of competition. It's the weird world we live in, and he was one of the first to navigate it. So Evan and I did a conference at Georgetown, I'm trying to remember, 4 or 5 years ago, because there were voices on the right and the left in both Republican Democratic parties saying that everyone who had worked on China before was naive and should have seen this coming. So we had a conference, Evan will recall, with pretty much every person who had worked on China policy since Nixon. And Republicans, Democrats, liberals, we all agreed it wasn't our fault. There was a consensus on that. But there were different explanations, as you'll recall, Evan. Some people, I think a majority pointed to what you said, which is agency, the great man theory, the impact of Xi himself. But I want to give Michèle and Kim and Phil a chance to give their views on what happened. Because our polls show, Chicago Council, Lowy, other polls show, not only the Australian public, but the American public was kind of optimistic about China until the last few years. So there was a broad consensus that engagement could work. And now you hear many voices, particularly in the US, saying it was never going to work. Is that right? What happened? I'll start with Michèle and then let Kim and Phil add to what Evan mentioned.
I don't think you can say it was never going to work. Having been in the final stages when we were doing the strategic economic dialogue and we were focused on, who was a leader and his coterie, we were getting traction in meaningful ways, and it felt like there was a possibility to keep, moving. It wasn't, we still would have the Taiwan diatribe from our PLA counterparts, and, but it was productive.
Iran and North Korea.
Yeah, it was particularly on areas outside of the region, Iran, North Korea, so there really was a change in the whole dynamic on the Chinese side when Xi came in. And, and I think it was a different set of behaviors from looking President Obama in the eye and saying, you don't have to worry about these new islands, we're never going to militarize them. And then going ahead and doing it, to just a much more forceful posture and stance in the region, particularly over disputed areas and so forth. So, I do think that the change of leadership had a profound impact, and I think there was also a period where there were a lot of people who wanted to hold on to the responsible stakeholder theory and keep trying, but you get enough data points that's just not working, and you need to adopt a different approach. And I think the biggest challenge is, too often I hear the United States blamed as, oh, you've gotten too aggressive with China. Why are you so aggressive with China? Why aren't you working to cooperate? And I think the truth is that with Xi, the focus shifted, and there was much less interest in cooperation, much less interest even in areas where we have shared interests, whether it's climate change or risk reduction. And it's just gone in a very different direction. So I think the Evans explanation really resonates with me in terms of what I sort of experienced.
So it is largely, it's not the Thucydides sort of structural rising power. It's Xi himself is a critical part of this.
There are certainly structural elements that feed into a more competitive environment, but I also believe that a different Chinese leader could be managing those dynamics in a way that would create much more opportunity for communication, deconfliction, risk reduction, even collaboration where our interests.
I was in probably most of President Bush's meetings with Hu Jintao, and I remember talking to Evan about the meetings with President Obama and Xi, and the tone was just completely different.
Totally different.
At one point, Hu Jintao would always try to reassure President Bush that he wasn't trying to challenge the U.S., and he would list all his problems.
Yes.
And he would say, every year, 25 million Chinese move to the cities. That's the population of Australia. And the interpreter garbled it. So it came out as every year 25 million Australians move to Chinese cities. So we had to sort of slow down and rewind. But Hu went out of his way. Remember, instead of peaceful rise, he said, no, it's peaceful development, completely different ideological frame, experience. Kim, where's your analysis?
Well, it's entirely Xi's fault.
Okay.
Absolutely, and I'd sustain that argument. The mess that has been created in relations with the region and the insecurities in it, the rest of it, is entirely down to Xi and nobody else. Because the Americans maintained for a very long time a willingness for constructive engagement with China, willingness to be helpful to China. I mean, it is the direct repudiation of Deng Xiaoping, letter by letter, of what Xi has done. And if Deng put a timetable on it, the timetable when what the Chinese have shifted into being permitted was 2050. And until then, the Chinese were supposed to have a peaceful face to the world around them. I think there are one or two unlucky steps. I do remember the Scarborough Shoals, and the Filipinos broke the rules on the kabuki dance, which had gone on for a long time, about whether or not they were allowed to police the shoals and that sort of thing. And I was being assured by the administration, we're going to put in a destroyer to cut the chain. The destroyer will go through and cut the chain. And we will, because we can't afford to have this sort of stuff developing. And the destroyer didn't go through and didn't cut the chain. And when I made inquiries of it, the Filipinos can be quite mad in policy, crazy brave. We do not want American policy to be controlled by the Filipinos. So it was a sort of different. The US had not made a mental adjustment to Xi because they didn't need to, because Xi has been a Xi in progress. So Xi as he was when he was a deputy is not Xi as he is now. He's just got worse and worse and worse since he's been in there. So now you've got to hope that at some point of time a faction will win in China, and we won't know about it because we haven't a clue what's going on in China. Will come into power and point them in a different direction. The fellow who looked as though he might was that Li Keqiang, but he got purged effectively.
And just died.
And just died, yes, that was even more unfortunate. But but there are people in China who don't cop this. China's huge, and they've got hundreds of opinions all over the place. But and so you want to be prepared to see if there's light. There needs to be light because Xi has moved way too quickly in the direction in which he's going, with a society completely unprepared for it. The economy is poor compared to what it's been. The Chinese demographic is beyond horrific. Beyond horrific. They're rapidly losing population. They're going to keep on going. I mean, I don't know what the last couple of years, but a couple of years ago, 43% of Chinese pregnancies ended in abortion. And the people being aborted were basically women, or girls were being aborted. I mean, to be a woman in China is to live a nightmare. And Xi said you can have 3 children. And the response of the women of China is, you have 3 children, because we're not going to be in it. Yeah. So if you go, it's 125 men to 100 women. Here it's sort of 53 women to 50 men. Most of the West, 51 to 50. And it's made worse in China because the natural rate of infertility amongst women of childbearing age is about 3%. In China, it's 20. So it's not only 125 to 100, it's really 125 to 80. And that is because of bad abortions. That's basically what's produced that situation. Nobody ever thinks about this. There's a great bloke, I advise you all, Yi Nanjiang. He's an obs and gynae man, but he's basically a mass data obs and gynae man. So he wrote a great book in 27 called Big Country, Empty Nest. And he does blog in China, Weibo or whatever it is they blog on, and the Chinese government doesn't interfere with it or criticise it because they think he might be right. And that's interesting.
So, Phil, I want to get your view on this. The spotlight's on Xi, see if you agree or disagree, but I also want to maybe break up the consensus a bit. Because if you look at the PLA strategy, posture, doctrine, what we see today didn't start with Xi in many ways. It has, you could argue it started with the 95-96 Taiwan crisis.
Oh, it did, yeah.
Or 2008-2009 when Hu Jintao was at least nominally the chair of the Central Military Commission. The A2AD island chain Indian Ocean strategy. It's not new. So just to sort of, push back on the consensus, the PLA strategy doesn't strike me as something that's new. When you were sitting in Indo-Pacific looking at today, do you see a sharp departure with Xi, or is it a bit more continuity?
I mean, to me, clearly there's an inflection point, and to be clear, I agree completely with the analysis about this being all about Chairman Xi. You can see, I had the occasion earlier this year to get together with many of the former PACOM commanders, everyone that was living but one. And we talked about the size and capability and the operational patterns of what we were seeing with the PLA. And you could see that the pre-Xi commanders were somewhat shocked at the change in the force levels, right, the structure, but the capability sets that were coming apparent to them as well. But just as shocking was the change in deployment patterns, how they were evolving not only in the Western Pacific, but globally into the Central Pacific, in and around U.S. territories, in and around allies. These all kind of relate back to the 2012 timeframe. So, you know, the PLA is kind of a separate matter. As I look back over the course of my career, there's always been a level of, well, I'll be frank, a level of arrogance that seemed outsized to their capability that was a little shocking in public forums, and that has persisted. And it explains, to a certain extent, some of the bad behaviors you see in the tactical environments, plane to plane, ship to ship, which aren't endemic and problematic in the sense that I believe any of those things are going to cause us to go to war. But they are problematic in the sense of how professionals operate, you know, in international sea and airspace, and how they should be treating each other, because it's out of the norm how they behave.
So I want to pivot to exactly that point, which is how dangerous is it?
Yeah.
In our survey that Jared and Victoria just briefed, 49% of Australians think war is very or somewhat likely. It's down. It's down, I think in part because of the Albanese government's diplomacy with Beijing, but half, roughly, of Australians. In some polls in Japan, I think it's about 80%.
Yeah.
How dangerous is it, Phil? And then we'll get everyone else in as well.
Yeah, you know, I've always been kind of a little upset at the repeating of this language of miscalculation, right? Because it's a Chinese talking point. They're trying to get us to end our activities in the theater without, you know, having to physically deter, you know, in and of themselves, right, of our activities. If you look back at the history of even just naval operations with the Soviets, with others, we've never gone to war over something going bump in the night. You know, we need to be thinking about miscalculation in the terms of a misreading of the will and commitment of, you know, the alliance structures that we have out here in the United States, the capability of our forces, things like that, the things that really go to the roots of deterrence. The way that our forces, Indo-PACOM, United States forces, the way Australian forces, the way our Japanese forces conduct themselves in this theater are in pursuit of the status quo. They are consistent with international law and always have been. There isn't any kind of nuanced changes to it. And it demonstrates not only a level of professionalism between the three of us that has, you know, paved its way to deepening the alliance, not only in a strategic sense, but in the tactical sense, plane to plane and ship to ship, but also I think shows and demonstrates to the region, you know, the level of competence and professionalism that is here. And we need to persist with that despite Chinese talking points and propaganda outlets that are trying to chase us out of the theater by their language.
The PLA does not want us to be comfortable operating.
Right.
They want this sense of risk and tension. Evan, how dangerous? There's the accident thing, which Phil just described as rarely a cause of war, actually.
Yeah.
But then there's the intent piece.
Right.
You know,
I mean, look, a crisis could come about, obviously, two ways. Number one, accident or miscalculation, and that's real because the Chinese have decided that they're going to assume more risk in their air-to-air, sea-to-sea encounters to try and push us back, right? And that's not just us. It's, you know, allies and partners, Australia and Canada. And then, of course, there's the other pathway, which is a deliberate action, which is they misread our will and our capability and, you know, decide to do something about Taiwan. But I think there's a broader point I want to make before we run out of time, which is, you know, the U.S.-China relationship today, we're in a totally different world than we've ever been in before. And we sort of lack the language to talk about it. Nobody really likes using the term Cold War because it's obviously evocative of a history that doesn't map nicely onto the U.S.-China relationship. But the reality is we're in a world now where the relationship is broad spectrum competition and will continue. It's military competition, it's security competition, it's technology competition, and increasingly it's a competition of ideas about about domestic and global governance. You can call it ideology. Ideology, again, is evocative of Marxism versus capitalism, which is, I think, confuses things. But we have to understand we are in a long-term, broad-spectrum competition, and no matter what happens in the next few months between Biden and Xi, Kishida and Xi, Albanese and Xi, that's not going to change the structural features of the relationship. And in particular, because of the nature of these four issues, security, technology, military affairs, and ideas, because they're so nested and they overlap with one another, it's going to be very, very difficult to compartmentalize issues in ways that allow us to manage that competition. So we're in a very, very different world, and importantly, domestic politics is now playing as great a role in the geopolitics of the U.S.-China relationship as ever before. And I think that worries me because I just finished a paper for the Asia Society on this. When you look at the changes in American domestic politics, so that's congressional politics, electoral politics, interest group politics, public opinion, and you look at the same things on the Chinese side, what you see is forces separate from the deliberate intentions of leaders on both sides, creating incentives for more and better competition. I mean, just look at the role of the U.S. Congress. I mean, the last five pieces of legislation on China didn't really have to do with the administration. They all came from the Congress. And of course, we all saw, Pelosi's visit. And in the game that Mike and his team set up, right, one of the precipitating factors in the Taiwan crisis was two very senior members of Congress going over to Taiwan, saying we need to reestablish relations with Taiwan. And the reason I highlight this is because domestic politics is something that is an area that's very, very complicated and difficult for an executive to control. So that's where allies and partners can actually play an enormously important role. In other words, if Australian policymakers come to Washington, talk to our political leaders, whether in the Congress or in the executive, and say, hey, some of these things that you're thinking about, we know that politically it may play well for you in your down ballot election, but it's going to make our world incredibly difficult. And oh, by the way, we're really worried that actually it might start a crisis. So we're now in a world of the U.S.-China relationship where the competition is broad spectrum, the incentives are to accelerate the competition, the traditional, let's call it, sources of stability or ballast in the relationship have diminished, and the drivers of domestic politics are only growing. I think we're entering into a period where the role of allies and partners in the region to come to Washington and sort of give us your view, to serve as perhaps a source of ballast or stability as the domestic political pressures grow. I think that's going to be very, very important.
By the way, since this may be your last chance, one more time the book.
Cold Rivals. So it's a collection of Americans and Chinese that we're looking at three questions. How did we get here? How did we get to this era of strategic competition? Number two, what is it going to be all about? And we look at the economic dimensions, technology dimensions, et cetera, et cetera. And then where is it going to take us? And it's a pretty sobering assessment from some very, very smart people. And the reality is the relationship, I think the best that you can say is that eventually over time, we might reach a point of sort of managed competition, something that looks like a competitive coexistence. But that's the best case scenario. What's much more likely is sort of this sort of slow burn towards rivalry over time that may or may not be punctuated by crises. I mean, one of the big ideas that comes out of many of the different chapters is the Chinese side, largely driven by Xi Jinping's own view of the world and his own policy preferences. He simply does not believe in the concept of strategic restraint. And the idea that if both parties accept some degree of restraint in either force structure or behavior in the sea or on the air, serves their interest. And the idea of strategic restraint really only became relevant between the U.S. and the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we sort of very much say, like, does the U.S.-China relationship need a near-death experience in order for both sides? Right. But that's sort of. But my point is, Kim, that's sort of where we are. We have a leadership that has such a determined view about what their ambitions are. I think they have an outsized view on what their capabilities are, and they're basically pushing and probing the boundaries. So there's a 1950s quality to where we are in the U.S.-China relationship. Both sides are concerned about the other. They're pushing and probing the boundaries. They're trying to figure out what risks they're willing to run, what costs they're willing to pay, and it hasn't really been established. And that's why the United States needs to work in lockstep with Japan, Australia, others in East Asia, to help set those boundaries for China. Because if you don't set the boundaries, they're just going to keep pushing.
So let's, we're going to wrap up, and I want to give the other panelists a minute or two each. But in particular on this question, where does this end? Is the scenario Evan and his co-authors from the US and China spelled out at best managed competition where we're heading? The baseball legend Yogi Berra famously said, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. So I'm not asking for a prediction per se, but I guess I am. Where does this go? And is it back to our discussion on Xi, is it about navigating the Xi era? Is this a century-long reality? How do you see it? We'll start with you, Michèle, and then hear from Kim and Phil.
Well, I think as long as Xi is the leader in China, if we can manage the competition short of conflict, we will be doing very, very well. Whether there's a different kind of leadership that's possible, I don't see signs of that yet, but I would love to be wrong on that, and it may be possible that a better outcome than simply avoiding conflict and managing competition might be possible in the future. Some of that may change, depend on what happens structurally inside China. But I do want to just underscore I agree with Phil that, an accident like a P3 type of situation that we experienced before is unlikely to stimulate a full conflict. But I think the strategic miscalculation is very real, whether it's Xi underestimating the resolve and capability of the US and its allies in the region, or like Putin overestimating in the Chinese system, it's not exactly a career promoting move to dissent or tell the boss all your problems and why you're not ready. So he is at risk of overestimating his own PLA. But the lack of any kind of real honest dialogue on strategic stability at a time when the Chinese are rapidly developing their nuclear arsenal, at a time when the PLA's doctrine is focused on trying to prevent US power projection by early attacks in space and on cyber. Their assumption is you attack critical infrastructure in the United States and the president and the public will panic and no, we don't want to project power in to respond to defend Taiwan. The truth is you take down the electricity grid around a US military base, you're going to take down the power of hospitals. Americans will die, and that will actually force a president into the conflict. And we have to have a forum to talk about that sort of stuff, to disabuse them of some of their fundamentally wrong assumptions, because it's that kind of miscalculation that could really lead us into a war that nobody wants.
Kim, do we just survive, or can we bend history and get back to a more productive?
Try to survive Xi, because Xi has made sure there's no other Xi.
Yeah.
So when Xi goes, it's almost invariably, I think, going to be the case that we're moved to a collective leadership again. So it's really only Xi, I think, that we have to survive. The only other thing I'd say is they do long-term very well. We need to do long-term. Us, you, the Japanese, are really very good at technology. The Japanese particularly very good at, America very good, but Japanese also very good at technology. We've got to look at all the holes in our position and fill them. Biggest hole, critical minerals, we can fill it. The Japanese can process it, so can the Americans. We just need to, there's stacks of stuff everywhere around the globe, but not in friendly hands. We are the ultimate friendly hands. That has got to be a centrepiece of the character of the relationship between the three of us and of AUKUS.
Phil?
Yeah, this is, at the end of the day, about ideology. I'm sorry to use the term, and for those smarter than me, you can parse this academically, but we have to remember that this discussion is not about Taiwan and the potential for conflict. It's about the long-term strategic strategy of China, which is to erode the international and operating norms in a way in which they can disrupt the system, the international community of nations that has been in place for some 70-odd years, and replace it with one of their own design. To us in America, really far away, perhaps we believe that won't really affect us, but it will. Because I think ultimately the set of international norms that would come out would exclude us from the economic apparatus, and frankly, I think our allies would be forced to rethink their relationships with us along the way as part of China's dictation of terms. So we have to think about that. When I speak in America, what does it take? We're talking about how much money, how much time, all that other kind of stuff. What needs to go in defenses, what needs to go in our economic institutions, our relationships. It only takes the will.
Yeah.
And we need to really recognize what the trajectory is here and come together and work on that. Very proud to be alongside allies like Australia and Japan. The liberal values, our freedom from arbitrary restraint, our willingness to honor the freedoms of our fellow citizens, they are driving us together in a way in which we need to be assured, or we need to assure our populations that we are going to preserve those freedoms. One only need to look at what's happened in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, along the line of actual control, in the South China Sea, to know that those freedoms are at risk. Yeah. And we need to check this up. So that's why a policy of deterrence is so important here.
So Evan mentioned it feels like the 1950s. History rhymes, it doesn't repeat. Of course, in the 1950s, U.S. trade with the Soviet Union was not even 1% of our trade. It's 13, 14% of our trade now is with China. For Australia, it's a third roughly. Japan's up there. That's just different. Is it the 1930s? The reality is in the 20s and 30s, we were quite economically interdependent with Germany, Japan, and Italy. Yeah. We don't know. We don't know. My takeaway from this excellent discussion would be we do have to keep open the pathway for a more productive relationship. And there are ways we can do it. And the afternoon panel will talk about de-risking. We don't want to make the mistake of the 30s of shutting down a trade with tariffs and things. Students and exchange really matter. Dialogue matters. I know, of course, the Prime Minister is going to Beijing. The Biden administration has tried to ramp up dialogue. We need to keep all of that and not foreclose options. That's critical. And then, as everyone said on this panel, and as we'll discuss this afternoon, our alliances and partnerships, which are much stronger than they were in the pre-war period, and much stronger than they were in the 50s. NATO is new, the US-Japan, US-Korea, and this alliance were new. The only ones we really had a long history of operating with were Australia, UK, New Zealand, Canada. And we were building new alliances then. We now have alliances that are substantive, that are, the polling shows, reinforced by common worldviews and values.
And the countries are just stronger.
And the countries are much stronger. It is a multipolar Asia. And Evan, you've heard me often when we do our own US-China dialogues, I emphasize to our counterparts from Chinese institutions who complain about small NATOs and blocs. I say this is actually good for US-China competition because the US is more dependent on allies. Just as allies are more dependent on the US has to listen to allies more. That's going to stabilize the competition. Allies and the US dependence on allies in the current environment is actually not bad for China. They don't believe me necessarily, but I think it's true.
It can be a source of ballast in the relationship, right? It can be a fire break on us doing provocative things. But of course, our politicians, both in the executive branch and the legislature, have to be open to it, right?
We'll talk about our politicians in a little while.
China is much harder than Russia or the Soviet Union. Much, much harder. But there's one thing that they haven't done. I mean, I just talk about it from my political party. We were always aware of the Muscovite agents of disinformation inside our show. And they've now all disappeared. There's no Chinese-based set of agents of disinformation making life impossible in the structure of our operations. So I'm assuming that that applies in other elements of politics around the globe. There's nothing there, no Chinese influence other than what can be bought. There's no ideological Chinese influence. So we just need to bear in mind we're in a different Cold War.
We are, and we can test those ideas now because we'll take a coffee break. We'll come back at 11 o'clock to hear from Simon Birmingham. So coffee's out there, restrooms are on the side, but also straight back. Thank you for an excellent discussion.